we've begun to understand that therefore we can use that emotional connection and the fact that we're designed to make sense of and enjoy sound and making sound with other people, to actually improve both physical and mental, psychological health.
Welcome to Inspiring Voices, the podcast of the Sing Up Foundation. We believe in harnessing the power of singing to improve mental health and well-being for children and young people. I'm Baz Chapman, and in this first series I'll be speaking with inspirational singers, music leaders, researchers and other specialists to consider the unique role of singing, songwriting, voice exploration and creative music making in transforming young people's mental health and well-being.
Inspiring Voices, a new podcast from the Sing Up Foundation.
I'm talking all things singing research with Professor Graham Welch, who is Chair of Music Education at UCL, Chair of the Society for Education, Music and Psychology Research, and heavily involved in the International Society for Music Education, as well as being a former member of UK Arts and Humanities Research Council Review College for Music. He's published numerous research papers into music and particularly singing, not least a publication called Researching the Impact of the National Singing Programme Sing Up in England in 2011. And that's really how Graham and I know each other, as I was looking after that programme at that time. So basically, Graham is the main man on everything to do with research into this thing that we call singing. Graham, welcome.
A pleasure. Lovely to be here with you.
So tell me, Graham, why are humans able to sing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's because as a species, we are designed to make sense of and use sound. So inside the womb, in those last 3 months, the final kind of trimester before birth, the auditory cortex for most of us is functioning, which means that we're picking up messages from the maternal sound world. We're picking up mum's voice and her partner's voice, voices of siblings. We're picking up the music she's listening to, environmental sounds. So we enter the world already primed for sound, as designed to be interested in sound, to find sound curious, And also we have, our brains are designed to detect patterns. The brains absolutely detest disorder, even if there is disorder. So each brain imposes order on disorder. And there's something about the structure of sounds and using sounds that we find attractive, which is why we are interested then in, as a species, in using sound. So we use sound to communicate in speech, as we're doing now, but also in another form of that, which is singing, which is, if you like, in one sense, it's a kind of expanded form of speaking, but communicating with each other. Another aspect of why we sing, I think, is because it's something we can do not just with ourselves, to amuse ourselves, which we see with very young babies, what's known as this euphonic cooing, as they kind of happily kind of lie there in their cot, burbling away, because they're just pleased with the world, or perhaps it's indigestion, who knows. And then that develops for us to something that we can share, because other people show an interest in the sounds that we make, your first sound or the first, whatever it is. So we are social animals as well as sound animals. And this means that we use speaking to communicate and share and be with others, but we also sing because we can do that to share things, to be with other people. There's been some interesting research that was published in one of the science magazines this week to suggest that people who kind of feel they have their minds are in tune with someone else's in that kind of conventional speaking way, um, in fact have brainwaves which tend to coincide. So there's something about empathy, that's critically uh, important.
I remember, I think one of my earliest memories would be singing with my dad at the piano and my brother, I think, something like a song like Happy Land or something like that. And it's really interesting how it's such a strong memory. It has singing in it. And we know that there's amazing things that singing can do with memory, and particularly for those
Yeah.
suffering with dementia and that kind of thing. Before we get on to that, just tell me a bit about your own kind of musical background. Did you sing when you were younger?
Well, singing was always there because my father loved these gizmos called radios and radiograms, and they were all the size of small houses. I mean, it's enormous pieces of furniture. And he would like on a Sunday morning to put the radio on in every room, and everybody danced and everybody sang. Of that kind of 30s, 40s, 50s music,
Yeah.
and it was just part of home. It's part of being in the car. My father loved just having that kind of music on. And then I went to a church primary school in Putney, and the local vicar used to come along once a week, a man called Canon John Pierce Higgins, enormous man, kind of filled the room, and he'd play the piano in a way that he was trying to kill it. It was he would really pound the piano. But because the primary school was associated with the local church by Putney Bridge, he then recruited some of us to be in the church choir. So at the age of, I think, 10 or perhaps 11, I then became a chorister. So I then got more formally into singing. And I had a wonderful a choir master, a guy called Stephen Rees, who was a professor at the Royal Academy of Harmony, but who believed everybody could sing. And so the choir was a wonderful collection of people who were relatively in tune. And we were always doing incredibly ambitious music, but for me, it was a whole new world, completely different from that kind of family, popular show type music.
That's
I just found it wonderful,
Yeah, that's so interesting that you had the importance of that person who believed that everyone could sing, and yet it still seems to be the case that there are lots of people in the world who feel that they can't. But why is that?
Because it's because of what counts as singing. I can remember being at a conference for the first time in a kind of an area north of Johannesburg. I think it was called Magaliesburg, which was a kind of nature reserve where we had an ISME research seminar. And after we'd had an evening meal, we went into this kind of lounge area, and someone came and said, "Would you like a drink?" We ordered some drinks, and we said to this, but I don't know how it came about. But do you sing? Just a silly question, really. So this woman then went off to the kitchen and brought everybody else back, and they just started singing. They just started performing for us and getting us to join in, and they were all moving. It wasn't a kind of stand in the corner in black and perform. It was just coming out in their working clothes and just making music vocally. And I think, so therefore, there are cultures in the world where people do just sing, whether they sing well or sing brilliantly or not very well. It doesn't really matter. You just sing. It's just kind of what you do. Whereas I think in our more kind of Western culture, we're used to the sense of someone being a performer and someone being a listener, although of course for young people, but adolescents who make their own music, this is all seen as slightly irrelevant. They just want to make music. They're not really interested in the quality of the voices. And some of our most famous rock stars, we wouldn't actually pick them out as having ideal voice qualities. But that doesn't matter. It's all part of their individual kind of charisma. But nevertheless, because we've got this performance culture, some people believe they can, and some people believe they can't.
I
It's
I think, was
ridiculous.
it Ken Robinson in one of his books said that Paul McCartney was not allowed into his school choir, and so he asked the question, how good was that choir? So it's really interesting, and I think looking back to when Sing Up was the government's national singing programme, there was a clear sense of particularly teachers having many of them having been told when they were younger that they couldn't sing or not to sing, and those scars seem to run very deep, don't they?
Yes, they do. And fortunately, I mean, there has been something of a sea change where you've got lots of professional singers, such as we came across in the Sing Up program, who are prepared to go into schools and community settings and mentor other adults who feel that they either can't or they aren't very good at it. Of course, that still can be a two-edged sword. If you've got someone who's highly competent, you still think, well, perhaps, but I can't sing like you. But the question is, can you sing like yourself? Can you be you with your own voice? That's all that really matters.
Singing like yourself, that's a really great way of looking at it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not trying to be something else, because it's something that's deep within us.
Yeah.
So how did you come to get involved in the research side of singing?
The Froebel Institute were recruiting during the summer to try to make up their numbers. And the previous year, they decided to introduce men into this all-female organization of like 600 students and 20 men or something. And I was interviewed as a very kind of late applicant in August by the head of sociology, who thought, wouldn't it be a wonderful experiment to appoint a married male student into this all-female virtually environment? So that was how I suddenly got into teaching. And when I was in teaching in my second year, the head of music was off doing his doctorate. And I came across this rather crazy guy called Charles Cleal, who had just got a master's degree from somewhere in Wales that was all about whether or not you could sing. I mean, his kind of metaphor was, the way of describing it was to say, it's like saying everybody has to do the high jump, but we're all going to begin at 4 foot. There wasn't any sense of building up to it. And this was a second year class, a morning class. We had a music class in I think in the kind of the one of the blocks on the ground floor. We were all in a circle, and there's Graham, who feels himself relatively sophisticated as a singer at that time, and these other people in the room, some of whom said, "Oh, I can't sing." So Charles sat in front of them and said, "Will you say your name for me?" And they said their name, and he was listening to the pitch. So he said, "Say it again." And they said their name, and he said, "Now copy me." And he sang their name back to them at the pitch that they'd spoken it. And suddenly he said, "Just copy me, don't think about it." And they did copy him. And for some of them, this was the first time they'd ever sung in their lives. And it was like the sun came out. It was like a light bulb, And I can still remember emotionally that extraordinary experience of, I just assumed at that moment, up to that point, people could sing or didn't, or some people, were good at it and some people were like everything else, And it was extraordinary that he took the sounds they were making and fed them back. So they were their sounds. but just expanded them a little, you know. A technique that I've used since, over the years. But I mean, it was one of those wonderful moments when you suddenly realize that singing is accessible to everybody. It's not just the few, you know.
So, if singing is one of those kind of fundamental things, why is research into it so important?
Well, I think research for me is important anyway, because if we're dealing with human behavior, as I encourage my students never to think about proof in that kind of hard sciences sense, because we're dealing with people, so it's a social science. We're dealing with an art form, so everything's rather fuzzy. So what we're looking for is evidence. What is the evidence we've got that people can sing? What is the evidence that singing develops? And because of those early experiences with that guy, Charles Cleal, on that morning, as soon as I became a primary school teacher a couple of years later, it was kind of part of my mission was to encourage all of my children to sing. And at that time, I came across some research published, I think, in 1969, something like that, by a guy called Joyner, who did some research into the monotone problem at Reading University. And he was reporting that there are some people that sang in tune, but in a lower key. And I can remember reading this, and I had a group of kids in the school hall, and I had this 10-year-old, rather tall girl standing next to me who was wildly out of tune. So I just kept transposing down this little melody. I transposed it down a sixth, and then she was perfectly in tune. And again, you could see her eyes. Suddenly, we were together in that moment. So that little piece of research, part of this guy's master's thesis, which then became a journal article paper, had a real impact on me at that moment with that particular child. And so for me, the importance of research is that we're constantly trying to understand why things happen, how things happen. And if we're interested in education, people pay us wages to make a difference, to change the world, not to accept the world the way it is, but to do something about it, to enable people to do things. We talk about enabling, we talk about fostering, we talk about mentoring. I wrote many years ago about children being clients for development. And that's the way I sing it. When my first research, I used some of the labels that were around. I hated the label monotone. That didn't make sense because I'd never come across a child that was on one note. But I did discover that there were some that hadn't really found any way of using their voices. And so my early research was trying to understand why that was and what we could do about it. And then you come across, through research, discovering that there were people trying to do something about this 100 years ago by getting your hands to move to a melodic shape. This was completely separate from solfa, and those kind of hand gestures. And you realize that people have always been curious about trying to help others to get this, what is my voice doing and I can't see it? So my own doctoral research was about using some speech science research from hearing to let you see the pitch of your voice. So I went off to the Royal National Institute for the Deaf, as it was then called, in London, and adapted one of their ideas and one of their machines during a simple little oscilloscope to show some children how their voices could move. This is before we had laptops and phones and all the wonderful technology. And again, it was like kind of light bulbs going off. You could see that oh my God, I can remember one little lad in my doctoral studies that had no um, real sense of what his voice was doing. And I put him in front of this machine. And as soon as he saw the voice trace, he started laughing. He started kind of giggling, because for him, this was the most extraordinary thing in his life, to actually see that his voice was doing something and he could see it and he could do something about it.
Yeah. So there's a lot of research out there now, isn't there, that looks at various aspects of singing for health and a whole range of conditions that now there is strong evidence, I think it's fair to say, around the way that singing can help people living with dementia, with Parkinson's, with lung conditions, and with a range of other what you might call chronic health conditions. We're starting to learn more now, I think, aren't we, about singing and its potential impact on mental health and well-being, particularly in young people. And it seems to me that there's perhaps two things in this. There is one, which is the well-being or mental health aspects of one's own connection with singing, because it can be a very exposing thing. There are those issues of whether you feel competent or not. But then there's also this power of singing to be able to connect us with emotions or ways of thinking or ways of connecting with other people. So just tell me where you feel we are now in our understanding of that connection of singing with mental health and well-being.
Well, I think with one of the concepts that I've explored, I was introduced to when I was working with some summer schools in the United States, was the concept of the human body mind, which was a concept that was generated by Candice Pert, who was an award-winning neuroscientist, I think in New York, many years ago, in the 80s. And she was fascinated by how emotion is kind of bound up with human health. And she spoke about the human body mind as being an integration of three systems: the nervous system, where we kind of think and experience the world, and that inner world of emotions and feelings, the endocrine system, and also our immune system, which keeps us alive and tries to deal with health threats, and how these three things are integrated. So we have no experience, a conscious experience or other than conscious experience, which isn't tagged somehow emotionally. Those inner parts of the brain which deal with emotion are always on. They're always kind of linking with other areas of the brain. So that every experience we have as a human has some kind of emotional correlate to it. And this is the way that the research has been going over the last decade or so. We've begun to understand that therefore we can use that emotional connection and the fact that we're designed to make sense of and enjoy sound and making sound with other people, to actually improve both physical and mental, psychological health, that we can do something about this, that there's something about making sound which addresses kind of the inner person and making sound with someone else and making sound with this instrument that we carry around with us is very cost effective. We haven't got to be taught to learn an instrument or play something. We've got the instrument with us. And therefore, I think there's lots of interest in how we can use that part of our human design to actually facilitate greater health benefits through the human voice. And of course, the human voice, if we're using it in that way and singing, we're actually increasing our oxygen intake. So it's a good aerobic workout. I mean, as we get older, as I know, recently I've been having one or two cardiac challenges, and the drugs that they put me on make me feel rather kind of dozy, and I get more out of breath, And it's important to realize that as we get older, much of our aerobic tissue becomes anaerobic. We become less efficient at actually taking up oxygen. And the critical feature, if you like, of singing is that we have to get in oxygen in order for the vocal system to work. So a byproduct of singing is actually keeping tissue healthy. Another byproduct is that the more oxygen we have, the more alert we are. So the more that it actually helps cognitive function, which again links with your question about mental health and emotion and how we feel about the world.
So
particularly if we make music
yeah,
with other people.
So if we take that back to the earlier years of life, from say early years through into adolescence, when the body and the mind obviously are changing and developing at their fastest rate, I suppose it could be easy to overlook singing as being something that's so nice to have and a sort of an add-on of your life. But is your understanding now that actually singing has much greater powers than that for someone who's growing up?
Yeah, I mean, we undertook with some colleagues, some Australian colleagues, we analysed a large data set of over 3,000 children, preschool children, in Australia called, I think it's called Growing Up in Australia is the data set. But we were able to have a look at aspects of music in the home before the age of 5, before children entered school. And what we discovered was that in some families there was lots of music, but most of the music was vocal. There was mums singing. They were singing established songs and nursery rhymes, but they were also singing songs off of the television. They were making up songs for part of the day's ritual, for getting up, for washing, for going to bed. And all of this singing activity, the more you had, the more likely you were to enter school at the age of 5 with much more developed pro-social skills. You're better able to make relationships with other children and other adults. You were better at numeracy. You were better at literacy, at using words and oracy, which was been mentioned recently by people in the Labour benches about this need to increase people's ability to talk, to communicate with others. And the Australian data was quite clear. There was this very strong statistical inference that the more singing that was going on in the home, the more children had these wider benefits, singing at ages 2, 3, and 4 on entry to school at age 5.
So, and presumably that translates then into the school environment as well, that the more they're able to carry that on through school, the more the ongoing benefits.
Yeah, well, I think because you're going to be entering school at least, if you like, with a head start, with at least, I can remember Alex, my son Alex, who just finished primary school, literally, just over a week ago. On his first morning, I can remember the teacher saying to me, you could tell instantly of the 20 kids that walked into his reception class age 5, those that had some experience of nurseries and what schooling was, they came in and they sat down, and in that sense of, all right, okay, so what's going on? Whereas there were others that came in and they were all over the place.
Mm.
And one of the challenges we've got in education is if we're not careful, we allow that difference to become established, so that when the children are 7 or 9 or 11, there is still that kind of gap because we've never quite caught up, which is why the early years is really absolutely so critical in nurturing children's intelligence, development, and their curiosity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such an important phase.
Yes, and one of the other areas that we're particularly interested in the foundation is where singing can be used potentially not only as a tool for kind of general well-being, but could also help to tackle some more profound challenges. So if there's been early life trauma, or if there are neurodivergencies which impact on mental health and well-being. And it seems like there is this kind of special power that singing has to be able to reach into the root of that issue and potentially provide an outlet for it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm just in the process of working with Margaret Barrett on finally getting Oxford to publish the Oxford Handbook. I'm just reading the title of Early Childhood Learning and Development in Music. And one of the sections that we curated there, we put teams together to look at various aspects of early childhood and music. And one of the sections is to do with children growing up at times of and experiencing trauma, such as in war zones or refugees or whatever. And again, the research evidence is so powerful of what a difference the arts in general and music in particular and singing can make to enabling these children that have experienced really nasty things to make sense of what's been happening to them, but also to have some very positive experiences with others and to share with others and to suddenly become part of newer groups and not just be different or someone that's going to be automatically scarred as an immigrant.
Yeah. You've spoken before about the importance of agency in this field. So the idea that whilst there can be lots of benefit in organised singing activities where you might be learning a particular song, there seems to be this additional, particularly in the world of mental health and well-being, area of actually, if those young people are more involved in the creation process and in actual kind of writing of music, it can have that much more profound an effect. And that's backed up by research, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. What we discovered in education that effective education, effective pedagogy, effective learning and teaching involves the learner feeling that education isn't something being done to them. It's something that's being done with them, that they have some sense of ownership, agency. And we've discovered in music that despite children having apparent special needs, whatever those are and whatever the degree is, that being able to manipulate sound to make music in some way engages their sense of self and agency, irrespective of whatever their neurological profile is, of whether they might be seen as having some profound special need or not. There's something about music and sound, which is where we started, and particularly about using the human voice, which enables people to connect, but also feel that they are doing something. And that's the art for me, of teaching, is what Jerome Bruner spoke about, this sense of scaffolding, of creating a safe framework where someone can do something. And your role then as the teacher is to enable them to experience and play with that. And the creativity is a constant kind of challenge for us in the formal educational world, because we feel we have to give kids facts, we've got to give them information, as opposed to thinking about, well, if we want them to have that information, what routes might we adopt to enable them to discover these things, which might take a little while longer, but in fact the things might be much more firmly embedded and useful.
Yeah, that's so true. I feel like particularly now there seems to be a generation of practitioner who has the mastery of the theory and the tools behind music, but knows how to adapt them to a situation. And certainly within the last 10, 20 years and the rise of the community choir movement, um, it feels like the approaches to singing have been really sort of exploded. I'm just back from a weekend with the National Teachers Choir where they would learn all of their songs within a weekend and be able to perform them at the end. And they would involve notes, and there would be some degree of musical literacy, and that's great to be able to help develop that. But some of the most powerful moments were the ones where we would say, okay, forget that, harmonize, just make it up, see what happens. And it feels to me like somewhere in the bringing together of those formal and less formal worlds is some real magical music making.
Yes, absolutely. Because you make a space in which there isn't a right or wrong answer. And that's one of the things I learned with all of my work with children over the years in working on singing and using technology, is that if you ask children to move their voices to imitate pitch patterns, if you do this with your fingers or whatever, and get them to do it, they can do it. And you realize that movement in terms of the vocal structure and the vocal folds and the relative tensions between the various bits of the musculature, these are things that you just have to experience. And then if you want someone to stop one particular gesture and hold a particular physical gesture equals singing a note and sustaining a note, then you have to have some sense of where that is in terms of everything else. From a psychological perspective, this is labelled as variability of practice, that we learn how to do things by encountering things in lots of different ways. So the classic example for me is always that if you go into a primary school classroom or a nursery classroom, or hopefully into a child's bedroom, you'll see lots and lots of books. But the font sizes are all different shapes. They're different sizes, they're different characters in the way that you and I, if we're typing a Word document, are asked to select our favorite font, And yet, despite that difference, we're still able to decode those letters to meaning particular sounds and to create particular words that we can recognize, even though visually they look different. And that kind of variability of practice is how we learn to read. And for me, it's the same with music. We have to give kids musical tools, give them where they can explore sound and recognize that sound can come in lots and lots of different ways. So that when we teach notation, we always talk about sound before symbol. Make the sound. Now draw me the sound. There's not a correct way of drawing the sound, right? But there may be a more or less ambiguous way. So get your friend to recreate your sound from your drawing. Yeah. So is that what you intended? Was it, well, would you like to adapt your drawing a little bit so that your friend recreates the sound that's in your head? And so that we begin through that creative process to understand that notation is something to be interpreted so that we can come back to a set of sounds, but they're not kind of reified into this is what the tune always is. Because if it was, we'd only need one recording of, I don't know, Bach's B minor Mass. We wouldn't need lots and lots of different interpretations. We'd only need one, but we don't. And we get inspired by new recordings of established works. because someone sees something, feels something different. And if we have half a dozen of them on a shelf, we might not always pick out the same one because of how we're feeling at that moment. There's a kind of creative reciprocal relationship between us and these musical products, which we can use in the world of education, as you say, and allowing people, giving them the right to explore their voices. Just do it. But no, don't worry about doing it correctly. Just do it.
Just do it. Looking ahead to the future, certainly the Sing Up Foundation is very interested in researching more, particularly in the world of singing for children and young people's mental health and wellbeing. From your point of view and from the experiences you've had of the research that's out there, are there any things that you'd love to see some research taking place into in this context?
One of the challenges that we've got is that some people will regard evidence as having to be in a particular form. So in a research environment, the gold standard is often a randomized control trial, for example, because that's what's used in other aspects of science or in medicine. I give this person this particular tablet and they don't fall over, so I give it to another person, and so on. And eventually I might then roll it out to lots of people. Whereas I think there needs to be a celebration of lots and lots of little wins in research that we need to encourage. It's not some people as researchers and some people who are users of research. If we see teachers as researchers, as being curious, and that our role as, again, using Bruner's label of senior, I'm a senior learner, means I've had a little bit more experience. So I use my experience to enable you to also to become a senior learner, to take yourself on, to be curious, not for me to give you the answers, but for me to share evidence with you so that you can try out and you can explore and give you the tools so that everybody becomes a researcher in that sense. So that if I suddenly visited a Silver Song class, for example, which is I've never actually taught or worked with that particular age group, despite my tender age. Perhaps I should, but just what tools would I need to be able to work in that sense effectively? What do I need? What do they need in order for them to have a successful singing experience? And I think that therefore we can empower our professionals, the people that are working in these environments, by giving them the tools to understand a little bit more of what's going on. We still need a team, some other researchers, for example, at the moment, trying to make sense of what is the brain doing? How can we facilitate different areas of development? If we understand the way the brain functions perhaps better, we might be able to create better pedagogy. Yeah. But the trouble is that most of us only have a very small window in which we look at the world. And so I suppose the answer to your question is that we need networks, we need groups, we need people to collaborate. As you said, you just had a weekend. You need people to work together, to share. Everybody has a little bit of the puzzle. There aren't those of us that have it sewn up. Everybody has some particular element of experience which is incredibly important, which they can share so that knowledge keeps growing. That's the important thing for me.
Great. And I very much hope that the Sing Up Foundation can be a part of that ideal of anyone who's involved in this has the ability to be a researcher and to understand the impact of what they're doing. And maybe we can be a place where some of that is brought together. Graham, to finish, I'm going to ask you, can you remember any particular breakthrough moments where your understanding of this field was hugely sort of leapt forward, or a moment of great revelation?
One time I ran a kind of private singing studio, and the people that came to me for help were often those professional singers whose voices would always be wonderful, and then suddenly they weren't, And can you help me? They've been to the ENT surgeon, they've been to the GP, they'd perhaps had speech therapy, they'd seen all of these specialists, but they still hadn't found a way back to whatever their voice was. And so the challenge for me was trying to understand who they were. What was their voice? What was this thing that they were trying to recapture? And some of those wonderful moments in that kind of studio setting was where suddenly something happened in which a voice that had been hidden or perhaps dormant or often damaged in some way could be released by having different thoughts. This physical structure is prone to being manipulated by the stuff up here. And if I can't do anything with this stuff, perhaps I can get in through here. If the surgeon said to me, there's nothing, I can't see anything wrong, then there's something up here that we need to work on. And those have been some of the most satisfying moments, whether it's working with adults or, as I said, working with children. Suddenly having a group of children that thought they couldn't sing or weren't very good at singing.
I would say, interestingly, that for me, one of the great breakthroughs in my own understanding of the value of singing was in my days as programme director of Sing Up, when it was the government-funded programme, and you were on board with Institute of Education, and we had that brilliant opportunity of a 4-year longitudinal study. And I remember you saying, when there was emerging quite strong evidence about the competency of young people to sing is the very best way of achieving that is simply getting them to sing regularly. Just that simple act of coming together and singing, not necessarily, with a singing teacher or with an expert, but just doing it regularly, was showing signs that young people were really kind of moving forward.
Yeah.
And that gave me so much pleasure, but also confidence that what we were doing was the right thing, that we were creating an environment where singing was normal and safe and enjoyable and giving people the tools to do it. And that was so just a wonderful thing to discover that was what was happening.
Yeah, normal. See, not special, just normal. Yeah. Just something that we do.
This is Inspiring Voices, the podcast of the Sing Up Foundation. Join us for the rest of the series on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts and other major platforms. You can also watch the video of each episode on the Sing Up Foundation YouTube channel.
Inspiring Voices, a new podcast from the Sing Up Foundation.